cold that settled over the upper Rockies that January night in 1843 wasn't just cold, it was the kind of deep, merciless freeze that stiffened leather straps, cracked water buckets, and made a man's breath hang heavy like drifting smoke. Outside Elias Hart's cabin, the thermometer nailed to a splintered post read 12 degrees below zero. The wind rolled down the valley in long, punishing waves, clawing at every gap in every wall it could find. In the neighboring cabins, men were stumbling from their bunks every hour half awake, feeding stoves that refused to stay alive. Wood piles that were supposed to last weeks were shrinking in a matter of days. Some were already burning scrap boards, anything that would catch flame. There was no comfort in any of those shacks, only the dull dread of watching the cold push through the walls like an invading army. But inside one cabin, something didn't make sense. Elias Hart, quiet, stubborn, broad-shouldered from years of trapping, sat alone at his small pine table, wrapping leather around a trap spring. No coat, no gloves, no trembling breath. The air inside his cabin held steady at 47 degrees, nearly 30 degrees warmer than the cabin next door. Warm enough to work, warm enough to sit still without shivering. And the stove in the corner cold, silent, hadn't seen a fresh stick of wood since the afternoon. The same men who'd laughed all summer at his stupid rock wall were now huddled in their own freezing cabins, wondering how, in God's name, Hart's foolish idea had turned into the only thing in the valley that winter actually respected. That night, winter cast its vote. And it voted in favor of the man everyone thought had lost his mind. Long before the winter of 43 proved him right. Elias Hart had already lived enough cold seasons to earn a lifetime of doubts. He wasn't born a mountain man, he became one out of necessity. Back east, he'd grown up in a world of drafty plank houses and potbelly stoves that swallowed wood like beasts. Winters there were sharp, yes, but not cruel. A man could always count on neighbors' sawmills or sheer proximity to warmth. The Rockies didn't offer such mercy. When Elias drifted west with the fur trade in his early 30s, he found a landscape that was both breathtaking and unforgiving. A place where storms descended without warning, where narrow valleys funneled wind into icy knives, and where even seasoned trappers sometimes didn't see spring. He spent winters in dugouts, crude shacks, and canvas tents stiff with frost. He watched men pile more wood onto a fire simply to keep the cold from taking their toes. But something about all of it troubled him. He noticed how a cabin could blaze with fire flames, licking high stovepipes glowing red, and yet still the air near the floor stayed bitter. How one man could burn twice the fuel of another and still freeze by morning. How a draft from the north wall could undo hours of hard-earned warmth in minutes. While most men cursed the cold and moved on, Elias watched. He paid attention to the cliffs that held the afternoon sun long after the sky dimmed. He rested in abandoned Ute rock shelters and wondered why the air inside felt steadier, calmer, almost gentle. He pressed his palm to dark stone after a day of sunlight and felt warmth that shouldn't have been there. He noticed that snow melted quicker where rock met day, but lingered endlessly on timber and brush. These little observations collected in his mind like slow-burning questions. Why did stone stay warm when wood did not? Why did some shelters hold heat while others lost it as fast as a man could feed a fire? Why were cabins built as if walls were nothing more than curtains to keep out the wind? Elias wasn't a scholar. He had no formulas, no diagrams, no theories from Europe. What he had was something rarer in the frontier time spent listening to nature instead of trying to outmuscle it. And slowly, stubbornly, a single thought took root. What if the real problem isn't the stove, but the walls themselves? The idea came to Elias the way frontier ideas often do, not in a flash of brilliance, but in a string of small, quiet realizations collected over miles of wilderness and years of cold. One spring afternoon, after checking his trap line, he found shelter beneath an overhang of weathered sandstone. The storm clouds rolling over the ridge promised hail, so he ducked inside it and waited. As the sky darkened, he leaned against the stone. It should have felt like death, cold, unforgiving, but instead there was a strange steadiness to it. Not warm, but not freezing either. A kind of thermal stubbornness. The rock didn't care how cold the wind got. It didn't flinch. It didn't surrender heat as quickly as wood. It simply held whatever temperature it had earned from the sun. That stubbornness lodged itself in Elias's mind. Later, camping with a band of Ute hunters, he noticed how their lodge, half sunk into the ground, lined with packed earth, held heat better than any log cabin he'd wintered in. No fancy stove, no roaring fire, just smart use of ground mass and placement. The Ute men didn't talk about insulation or thermal inertia. They just knew the land, and the land taught them what worked. Elias tucked that lesson away too. By midsummer, as other mountain men busied themselves repairing traps or gambling away their spring earnings, Elias walked the valley alone, studying things most folks never gave a second glance: the thickness of stone ledges, the way heat lingered in canyon walls, how dry clay behaved when packed tightly around rocks. He'd crouch for long minutes, feeling the temperature difference between stone and timber, running his hand across their surfaces like a man testing the hides of animals. To every curious voice that asked what he was doing, he'd simply answer, "Studying winter, while it isn't here." That summer he didn't hunt as much, didn't gamble, didn't drink like the others. Instead, he sketched crude diagrams in soot on a plank of wood, 2 walls, one inside, one outside, separated by a thick belly of stone, gravel, clay, and earth. A wall heavy enough to become a thermal reservoir. A wall that could swallow the heat from a fierce short burn and release it slowly, gently for hours after the fire died. An idea no one had asked for. A solution to a problem everyone accepted as unavoidable. He whispered it aloud once, testing the words, "Let the wall do the work, the stove can't." And with that, the decision was made. When the thaw came, and the valley burst to life with green tips and rushing water, Elias sharpened his tools, marked out the footprint of his cabin, and began gathering stone for a wall no one believed in, a wall that would change his winter and everyone else's. When the summer of 1842 settled over the valley, most men spent their warm months building quick cabins, simple log structures made to keep out the rain and little else. By autumn, they'd be stuffing moss into the cracks and hoping their stoves could muscle through the winter storms. But Elias Hart, he built differently. He started by raising 3 ordinary log walls, solid, tight, nothing that drew attention. But then, he turned his focus to the north side, the side every old trapper knew was where winter launched its attacks. That's where he began doing something no one had seen before. First, he raised a normal log wall. Then 4 feet inside the cabin, he built a second wall, a shorter one parallel to the first. A wall for a wall, a spine behind a spine. The gap between the two, nearly 18 inches, looked to everyone else like a mistake. Men wandered by with hands on their hips, shaking their heads. "You building stables in your living room, Elias. You forget which way a wall's supposed to face. 2 walls and no roof. That's twice the work for half the cents." Every joke stuck its landing. Elias simply kept working. He hauled stone big, small, flat, rounded from the creek bed. He mixed clay with sand until it formed a mortar that stuck to his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he packed the space between the 2 walls full of mass rocks, layered with gravel, then pressed tight with clay. It was heavy, backbreaking work, and it looked unreasonable, like he was trying to anchor the cabin to the center of the earth itself. Then he did something even stranger. Instead of setting his stove against a corner like every other man in camp, he placed it directly in front of that interior stone wall. He rebuilt the stovepipe so it didn't go straight up, but instead ran horizontally behind the stone mass, threaded through a shallow channel he carved with his own hands before finally rising toward the roof. A stovepipe that didn't go straight up. A wall stuffed with rock inside a cabin. A man rearranging physics with a pickaxe and stubbornness. The ridicule intensified. One of the miners, red-bearded and loud, slapped his knee, laughing, "Heat rises heart. You can't warm a rock belly first. You're sending your fire sideways into a tomb." Another man walked around the cabin twice before declaring, "You're digging your own freezer, not fixing it." But Elias only gave a small, tired smile, the kind men wear when they know something the crowd doesn't yet understand. "Winter will vote," he said softly, "not you." By the time frost first touched the valley, the wall was done. A thick, dense, immovable structure, half stone, half earth, all-purpose. A wall no one trusted. A wall no one believed in. A wall that would soon embarrass every man who mocked it. The first real test came earlier than anyone expected. By late October, a sharp wind swept down from the high peaks, dragging with it a storm so bitter it felt like winter had arrived months ahead of schedule. Snow fell hard, thick, wind-driven sheets that plastered against cabin walls and sealed the valley in a sudden icy hush. Men cursed the timing. No one was ready. Inside the cramped cabins, scattered along the timberline, fires roared from dawn till midnight. Logs disappeared into iron stoves faster than anyone wanted to admit. And still the cold seeped in. It crept across floors curled under bunks and settled like a living thing in the corners of every room, all except one. Elias Hart waited until the storm fully settled, until the wind was pushing hard against the north wall of his cabin, the very wall every man had laughed at. Then just past midday, he built his fire. But he didn't feed it slow and steady the way others did. He didn't make a day-long burn. He did the opposite. He split his pine into thin, sharp-edged pieces, fuel meant to burn fast and hot. He stacked them carefully inside the stove, opened the draft wide, and let the fire roar like a forge. Flames tore through the wood. The iron crackled. Smoke raced through the flue, scraping its heat along that hidden stone channel built behind the wall. The rest of the cabin warmed quickly, sure any fire would do that. But Elias wasn't watching the room. He was watching the wall. At first, when he laid his hand against the stone, it felt dead cold. A lifeless slab. But after an hour of fierce burning, something subtle began to shift. The stone no longer felt like winter's servant. It felt like it was waking. Slowly, reluctantly, as if centuries of silence had taught it patience. Another hour passed. The fire still thundered, and the stones absorbed everything the flames offered. Then Elias did the unthinkable. He let the fire die. While his neighbors were loading their stoves with another armful of wood, he simply closed the draft, shut the stove door, and sat back on a low bench across from the wall. Outside, the wind screamed. Snow slammed against the cabin's flank. Inside, the only light was the fading glow from the stove's dying embers, and yet the room didn't cool. It held. The wall radiated a slow, steady warmth, deep mellow, almost like the gentle heat of rock that's been kissed by hours of afternoon sun. It wasn't blazing hot. It wasn't dramatic. But it didn't flicker or fade. It seeped into the room with the patience of something that had all night to give. By evening, the cabin hovered at a temperature no storm had any right to allow. By midnight, it was warmer than most cabins were with a full fire going. And by dawn, when other men woke to frost on their blankets, Elias opened his eyes to a room still holding the comfort of yesterday's heat. The wall had taken its first breath, its first test, its first quiet victory. Elias ran his palm across the stone one more time, almost gently. This, he whispered, is only the beginning. In the early frontier, a man's opinion meant little. A man's results, those were gospel. So when the first October storm passed and the valley thawed just enough for men to step outside without their mustaches freezing stiff, Elias Hart walked over to his nearest neighbor, knocked twice, and quietly borrowed the one instrument nobody argued with. A mercury thermometer. He didn't explain much. Just said he wanted to check a few things. Most of the men assumed he was trying to prove his weird stove placement wasn't a total disaster. A few thought he might finally be realizing his rock belly wall was a fool's errand. But Elias wasn't interested in opinions. He wanted numbers. That night, with the temperature dropping faster than daylight, he hung the borrowed thermometer by his door. He let the cabin cool, naturally waited until the air inside matched the outside chill, and then started his usual rapid hot burn, 2 hours of intense heat, charging the wall. After the fire died, he marked down the time, took a last look at the thermometer, and crawled into bed. By dawn, the wind had risen again. The valley was coated in white. And when Elias stepped out to read the thermometer, its little red column sat at 44 degrees. Cold, yes, but survivable. Workable. A temperature that let a man move his fingers, shape leather cook breakfast without numb hands. Later that morning, for comparison, he walked to the next cabin over. Same storm, same valley floor, same hour. The thermometer on Tom Keegan's wall, 15 degrees. 15 degrees inside a lived-in cabin with a full night's worth of firewood burned down to ash. 29 degrees of difference. Tom was stomping around wrapped in blankets, breath fogging in the air. He complained about drafts, cursed the wind, and accused his stove of turning traitor. When Elias quietly mentioned that his own cabin wasn't nearly as cold, Tom stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You running the stove all night?" he asked. Elias shook his head. "You seal the whole place in clay like a root cellar." "Nope." "Then how in blazes?" Elias hesitated only a second before answering with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a summer being mocked. "It's the wall." Tom blinked, unsure whether to laugh, swear, or accuse Elias of lying straight to his face. But Elias didn't argue, didn't brag, didn't explain. He just walked home, sat by the warm stone rising behind his stove, and wrote the numbers down carefully in a small, weathered notebook, his first real proof that the wall wasn't a superstition or a hopeful hunch. It was working. It was measurable. And the valley, whether it knew it yet or not, was about to start caring very much about Elias Hart's strange, stubborn idea. Winter does what pride never could. It humbles a man. And in the last days of January 1843, winter came with a vengeance the valley had not seen in years. The storm rolled in from the high passes like a living wall, howling wind, fine-grained snow that found every opening, and a cold so sharp it cut deeper than steel. Within hours, the world outside disappeared beneath a white roar. Inside the scattered cabins, panic began to whisper. Men woke, shivering teeth, clacking the fire in their stoves, burned down to nothing but a faint orange glow. The wood piles they had stacked with confidence in the fall were shrinking too quickly. Many had to claw through snowdrifts just to reach their logs. Others found their hatch doors frozen shut. One man burned the legs off his table. Another split a chair. Worst of all, in several cabins, the stove lifeline of frontier winter went out entirely. And in that kind of cold, a dead stove is a death sentence. Around midnight, as the storm slammed the valley with its full fury, Tom Keegan fought his way through chest-deep snow toward Elias Hart's cabin. His scarf was crusted with ice, his eyelashes white, his gloves stiff as bark. When he pounded on Elias's door, the expected hope to find a fire roaring inside. What he found instead stopped him cold. Elias opened the door to a soft glow, a quiet room, and warmth. Not blazing heat, not the wild blast of a freshly stoked stove, but warmth, gentle, steady warmth that felt like a small blessing in a night designed to kill. The stove in the corner sat cold, its iron black, its belly empty. And yet the air was warm enough that Elias wore only a shirt, no coat, no hat. The warmest object in the room was the massive stone wall radiating a deep, unhurried heat. like a living thing. Tom stepped inside, stunned. "How?" he managed. Elias didn't answer with arrogance. He simply pointed toward the stone. "The wall's still giving," he said, "even without fire." Tom held up his own thermometer with a shaking hand. The last reading he'd taken inside his cabin was 15 degrees. The thermometer hanging near Elias's door read 44, 29 degrees of difference. The exact number Elias had quietly written into his notebook days earlier. Within an hour, word spread. By dawn, 3 more men had appeared at Elias's door. Faces pale, hands numb, breath smoky in the freezing air, carrying blankets, a child, even an old dog. They didn't bring pride. They brought need. Elias laid down extra bedding along the warm stone. The men stretched out like lines of driftwood. And for the first time that night, their shivering eased. The same men who had mocked him in the summer were now whispering prayers beside his stupid wall, hoping it would save another hour, another night, another life. And it did. Outside, the storm screamed and clawed. Inside, the wall held steady, unbothered, unwavering, quietly keeping men alive. By morning, no one laughed at Elias Hart. Not anymore. Not ever again. The morning after that brutal storm, when the wind finally eased and men felt brave enough to step outside, a question hung in the freezing air, heavier than the snow on the rooftops. How in the world could a cold, dead wall keep a cabin warm? Most of the valley thought warmth came from only one place: a roaring fire, a stove glowing hot, flames hungry enough to make the iron sweat. But Elias Hart had built something that didn't follow the rules the rest of them lived by. His wall worked because it didn't fight the cold. It absorbed the heat, not for minutes, not for the length of a single fire, but for hours, sometimes days. And the way it did that wasn't magic. It wasn't European engineering. It wasn't something he read in a book. It was simply physics wearing a frontier coat. 1. The wall was a heat sponge, not a barrier. A thin log wall pushes back against the cold the way a bed sheet pushes back against rain. Only so much it can do. But stone behaves differently. Packed earth-layered rock clay, rammed tight between every gap, together, they form a mass that absorbs heat slowly but refuses to let it go quickly. Every minute that Elias's stove flue brushed hot air against that hidden stone channel, the wall was storing energy like a giant thermal battery. Most cabins heated the air. Elias heated the structure. And structures don't forget heat quickly. 2. Radiant heat, the one kind of warmth you can't fake. When the fire died in other cabins, the warm air floated to the rafters, leaving the floor cold enough to bite. Elias's wall didn't warm air first. It warmed people first. It radiated heat in long, deep waves, and the same comforting kind you feel from a sun-warmed rock or a brick hearth that still glows at midnight. Even when the air in the room hovered around the 40s, the radiant warmth made the space feel akin to 55 or 60. That's why Elias could sit in shirt sleeves while others shivered under blankets. His cabin wasn't fighting the cold. It was breathing out warmth. 3. Slow, silent convection replaced the blast furnace approach. In a normal frontier cabin, heat moves like chaos. Hot air shoots upward. Cold air rushes in below. Drafts swirl like ghosts around a man's ankles. But in Elias's cabin, the warm stone lifted air softly, creating a slow, gentle circulation. No gusts, no blasts, no lurches of temperature. Just a steady loop of comfort. It wasn't spectacular. It wasn't dramatic. It simply worked quietly, predictably, relentlessly. 4. The wall smoothed out temperature swings. Normal cabins were roller coasters. Fire blazing, too hot. Fire out, too cold. All night long. Elias's wall flattened that curve completely. It didn't matter if the fire was roaring or dead as a rock, the wall kept giving. It blunted the cold, stretched the heat from a 2-hour burn into a 10, 12, even 18-hour cushion of livable warmth. A stove gives you heat when you feed it. A wall gives you heat when you need it. That difference saved lives. 5. The wall was a teacher in disguise. When Elias first tried to explain any of this in the summer, men laughed. They couldn't imagine a wall being anything more than a barrier. But winter has a way of clearing confusion, and on that stormy night, as the valley shivered and Elias's cabin stood warm and steady, the truth became undeniable. The stove heated the fire. The stone heated the man. Frontier wisdom distilled to a single lesson. When folks finally understood that, the valley changed. People listened. They asked questions. They rebuilt, rearranged, reconsidered. And for the first time, a handful of mountain men realized maybe the quiet man with the strange wall wasn't crazy at all. Maybe he was simply ahead of his time. What Elias Hart built wasn't just a clever heating trick. It was a quiet rebellion against the way cabins had always been built and against the way men assumed winter had to be endured. Most cabins in the Rockies followed the same pattern: quick to build, quick to heat, quick to lose that heat. Thin log walls, drafty seams, a single iron stove asked to do the job of both fire and architecture. Heat blasted into the room, drifted upward, then slipped right out the cracks. All night long, men paid for mistakes in sweatwood and lost sleep. Elias had seen that pattern enough times to know it was a fight a man could never truly win. So instead of fighting harder, he asked a question almost nobody on the frontier bothered to ask. What if the cabin itself could carry part of the load? That small, stubborn question wasn't fancy engineering. It was simple survival logic, and the lessons behind it were as old as the land itself. 1. Wood burns fast. Mass burns slow. A fire gives you quick heat. A stone wall gives you slow heat. On the frontier, men trusted the quick because it felt good in the moment. But the slow heat, the kind that lasts long after the fire goes out, was what kept people alive. Elias's wall didn't care about midnight. Didn't complain when the wind rose. Didn't wake him every hour needing another log. It held its warmth the way an old friend holds a promise quietly and without attention. 2. Nature already knew the answer. Every animal in the Rockies had long ago learned what men kept ignoring. Marmots burrow into earth for warmth. Wolves curl up against sun-heated stone. Even the cliffs themselves store the day's heat and give it back long after sunset. Nature uses mass to survive cold. Elias simply copied what he saw. Frontier wisdom isn't invention, it's imitation. 3. Comfort isn't about air temperature alone. Ask any older mountain man and he'll tell you cold doesn't just live in the air, it lives in the walls, the floor, the places your bones lean against. Elias's cabin was warmer because the surfaces around him were warmer. Warm walls, warm bench, warm corner behind the stove. Even if the air hovered near the 40s on the coldest nights, the experience felt like the mid-50s. That's radiant comfort, something no amount of air heating can fake. You don't heat the air to warm a man. You heat the things he touches. 4. The wall turned brawn into brains. Most mountain men believed survival was about toughness. Chop more wood build, bigger fires, burn longer. Elias used the same amount of effort but redirected it. Instead of spending the winter lifting logs, he spent one summer lifting stone. One season of sweat for a lifetime of easier winters. That's frontier economics at its finest. 5. The cold exposed who was thinking ahead. When the January blizzard hit the valley, learned something uncomfortable. Men who built fast cabins were freezing. Men who relied solely on wood were running out. Men who mocked innovation were sleeping on Elias's floor. And the man who spent his summer doing the strangest, most ridiculed thing in the valley. He slept warm. He slept long. He slept without fear. Winter has always been the great teacher of the Rockies. And in the winter of 1843, the lesson was simple. Brains beat bravado. Design beats effort. And the man who prepares beats the man who hopes. One clever idea might save a man once. A refined idea can save him every winter for the rest of his life. And Elias Hart, quiet, patient, observant, wasn't satisfied with the wall merely working. After that first October storm proved the concept, he set himself to studying the details the same way he studied tracks along a trap line. Every cold snap was a teacher. Every warm night was a note in his mind. Every flaw was a chance to improve the design. And over the seasons he learned a few things only long practice can teach. 1. Heat loves a path, so he made that path smarter. After the first winter, Elias noticed the warmest part of the wall was the section closest to the stovepipe. The upper half carried heat beautifully, but the lower half closer to the floor lagged behind, so he rebuilt the channel. He widened certain parts and narrowed others, forcing hot air to linger in colder pockets. He added a gentle downward slope at the start of the flue's horizontal run, making the hot smoke brush the bottom of the stone mass before rising toward the roof. More contact meant more captured heat. More captured heat meant more stored comfort. 2. He thickened the base where heat leaked fastest. Elias discovered something that modern engineers now call thermal bridging. Heat escapes fastest where mass is thinnest. So he thickened the base of the wall by several inches, hauling in bigger stones and packing them tighter. It was miserable work done in late summer when mosquitoes were thick and the sun burned hot. But it paid off. By the next winter, the floor corner nearest the wall stayed several degrees warmer. Enough to keep boots pliable. Enough to keep frost off the water bucket. Enough to keep sleep undisturbed. 3. Clay was good, but better. Clay was better. The first year, Elias used whatever clay he could dig up around the creek. It worked, but cracks formed. Heat leaked through hairline fractures that acted like tiny chimneys. So he experimented. He mixed more sand for strength, more fine silt for smoothness, and even crushed bits of charcoal to slow shrinkage. That new clay sealed tighter, no cracks, no drafts, no loss. He didn't have the vocabulary for thermal resistance or air sealing. But he knew a tight wall holds heat the way a tight trap holds a beaver. 4. He added a stone bench for human warmth. By the third winter, Elias realized something else. If the wall could heat the cabin, it could heat the man more directly. So he built a low stone bench along the base, a place to rest warm the back. Warm the hands thaw, stiff joints after a day on the line. It absorbed heat just like the wall, that then gave it back at body height instead of ankle height. That bench became the heart of the cabin. It was where he ate mended gear, sharpened blades, and read by lantern light. Neighbors who visited during storms gravitated toward it instinctively. Like tired old dogs seeking the last warm patch of sun. Efficiency isn't a one-time trick. It's a way of seeing. What set Elias apart wasn't the wall itself. It was the mindset. Most men saw a cabin as a box to hide from weather. Elias saw it as a machine, one that could either fight winter or work with it. And the more he observed it, the more the cabin taught him. With each season, his improvements stacked on top of each other, turning a simple stone experiment into one of the most efficient heating systems the valley had ever seen. Not because he was smarter, not because he was lucky, but because he paid attention. That's the kind of wisdom older generations understand better than anyone. You fix a thing once to survive. You fix it again and again to live well. Elias Hart never imagined he was inventing anything new. In his mind, he wasn't an engineer, a scientist, or a man ahead of his time. He was simply trying to make winter a little less cruel. But the strange thing about frontier wisdom is this: what one man discovers out of necessity often becomes a blueprint for others generations later. And today, nearly 2 centuries removed from Elias's storm-battered cabin, the lessons inside that stone wall still apply. Maybe now more than ever. 1. Heat your mass, not just your air. Most modern homes heat air, then try to keep that air from escaping. But air is restless. Air slips through cracks, climbs, ceiling seeks exits. Mass is patient. If you heat the heavy things, stone, brick, concrete, cob, They warmed the air slowly, evenly, and for far longer than any rush of hot air from a blower. Elias didn't know the phrase thermal inertia. He simply felt that a warm stone doesn't forget. Neither should we. 2. A small hot burn beats a big lazy fire. Mountain men used to say, "Feed the fire, or the fire feeds on you." Most stoves wasted wood because the burn was slow and inefficient, half smoke, half flame. Elias flipped the script. He burned fast and hot, letting the fire charge the wall and then shut it down completely. Modern masonry heaters and rocket mass heaters use the same logic: short burn, long reward. It's the difference between working harder and working smarter. 3. Radiant heat is a kindness the body understands instantly. Air heat blasts you. Radiant heat holds you. A warm wall floor or bench warms bones, joints, backs, old injuries, cold hands. It warms a person, not just a room. If you're over 50, you know exactly why that matters. There's a reason people fall asleep by rock fireplaces even long after the fire is gone. Radiant heat is comfort without the fight. 4. Your cabin should do some of the work. Most people rely entirely on devices, furnaces, stoves, heat pumps. But a cabin, if thoughtfully designed, can do half the heating without burning a single extra log. What Elias built was passive heat storage long before anyone used the word passive. Your home tiny house workshop, homestead cabin can store heat too if you build a masonry bench, an interior stone wall, a brick or cob surround behind your stove, a heat channel that makes exhaust linger in the right place. Frontier methods are not outdated. They're underused. 5. The less you depend on fuel, the more control you have. Elias didn't build the wall because he wanted to save wood. He built it because he didn't want winter owning his sleep, his schedule, or his safety. The same holds true now. Less fuel, less stress. Less fuel, anokike, fewer trips to haul wood. Less fuel, more resilience when storms lock you in. Less fuel, more predictable, steady comfort. A wall that works for you means you're not chained to a stove handle all night. Older viewers understand this deeply. Comfort is not just warmth, it's freedom. 6. Wisdom ages well. Technology ages fast. Iron stoves rust. Propane lines crack. Heat pumps break. Furnaces fail. But stone endures. The simplest systems last longest. The ones that borrow from nature outlive the ones that try to outsmart it. Elias didn't chase complexity. He chased durability, and winter rewarded him for it. In a world hungry for quick fixes, his stone wall offers a quiet reminder. Don't just burn harder, build smarter. People in the valley like to say, Elias built that wall to save wood. But ask any old mountain man who lived through more than one frontier winter, and he'll tell you plain. Wood was never the real cost. The real cost was time, sleep, and safety. Most men burned their way through winter the only way they knew how: feeding a hungry stove every few hours, day and night. If you slept too deeply, the fire died. If the fire died, the cold crept in. If the cold crept in long enough, a man could wake up with frost on his blankets, ice in his beard, and fingers he could no longer trust. But Elias Hart's wall changed that rhythm entirely. He didn't build a heating trick. He built a different kind of life. 1. Fewer night wakings, more human rest. Ask anyone over 50 what the cold does to a body. It stiffens joints. It wakes you every hour. It gnaws at your bones. Before the wall, Elias lived like every other trapper, jerked awake by cold drafts, stumbling in darkness toward a stove that demanded one more log. After the wall, he slept, not lightly, not anxiously, but in long, deep stretches of rest the frontier rarely allowed. In a land where sleep could mean the difference between sharp decisions and fatal mistakes, that was priceless. 2. A cabin that didn't turn against you. A wooden cabin is like a friend who panics easily 1 minute, warm the next minute, abandoning you to the cold. Temperature swings were enormous, too hot when the stove was going freezing when it wasn't. But Elias's stone wall didn't swing. It didn't spike or crash. It stayed predictable. It warmed the way a good conversation warms, slow, steady, lasting long after the moment has passed. 3. Less fire means less risk. Frontier men didn't fear wolves or storms half as much as they feared something quieter, fire in the walls. A stove that needs feeding every 2 hours is a stove burned too hot, too long, too often. Sparks escape. Embers roll. Chimneys ignite. By building a system that required fewer burns, short, controlled, efficient burns, Elias cut the risk dramatically. Safety doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's a quiet wall refusing to lose heat. 4. Heat for those who needed it most. When 7 grown men slept shoulder to shoulder along that warm stone during the January blizzard, the wall proved its value better than any number or theory. It wasn't just about efficiency. It was about mercy. Old men, a boy with shivering hands, a neighbor with frostbitten toes, even a half-starved dog curling up against the stone. The wall didn't burn hotter for them. It didn't know they were there. It simply kept giving. A steady, enduring warmth that didn't demand anything in return. 5. A smaller life that felt larger. Most people think reducing fuel use is about frugality. But for Elias, burning less wood meant gaining something else. Time. Time to mend gear. Time to hunt thoughtfully, not desperately. Time to rest, red carve, repair. Time to live, instead of just endure. A wall that stores heat gives a man back the hours he once spent fighting the cold. That's the real richness of a simpler life. 6. Comfort isn't a luxury. It's survival. The frontier had a brutal rule. Comfort isn't weakness. Comfort keeps you sharp enough to stay alive. Elias didn't chase comfort for its own sake. He chased stability, something older viewers today understand intimately. Warmth that doesn't flicker. A system that doesn't fail. A night's rest that isn't a gamble. People today talk about minimalism as a trend. Elias lived it because the wilderness demanded it. And in that stone wall, he created a kind of comfort that wasn't about softness, but about strength. In the end, the real gift of his invention wasn't heat. It was dignity. The ability to stand upright in winter and say, I'm not at the mercy of the cold anymore. There's an old saying among the mountain men, the frontier doesn't care how things are usually done. Tradition mattered less out there than results. Yet most men, out of habit, pride, or simple exhaustion, kept repeating the same designs their fathers, uncles, and neighbors used. A cabin was built because that's how a cabin was supposed to look. A stove was placed in the corner because that's where stoves had always gone. A fire was fed constantly because everyone believed that was the only way to survive winter. Elias Hart broke that pattern, not because he wanted to be clever, not because he enjoyed being different, but because winter forced him to think. And the frontier, for all its harshness, rewards the thinker more than the follower. 1. Innovators are mocked, right up until they're needed. When Elias built his double wall, the teasing was relentless. Men called it foolish, called it a waste of time, called it the Hart icebox long before they knew it would become the valley's warmest refuge. This wasn't unusual. Frontier innovators were always met with laughter. The first man who dug a root cellar was called paranoid. The first family to use sod walls instead of logs was called lazy. The first settler who double-chinked his cabin was told he was making extra work for no reason, until winter proved them right. The line between crazy idea and frontier wisdom has always been thin, and winter decides which side a man stands on. 2. The frontier doesn't reward noise, it rewards proof. Talk meant very little in the Rockies. The land itself was the judge. A bragging man and a humble man faced the same storm. One froze, the other slept warm. Elias didn't argue with his critics, didn't debate, didn't justify. He simply let January speak for him. And when the storm passed, every man in the valley remembered exactly who had been warm and who had been burning furniture just to stay alive. 3. The courage to build differently is rarer than the skill to build well. Building a heavy interior wall wasn't the hard part. Any man with a strong back could have done it. The hard part, the truly rare part, was believing that a different idea might succeed. Frontier men could lift stones all day long. But lifting themselves out of tradition, that was the weight few could carry. Elias didn't think of himself as brave. But in a landscape where conformity often meant freezing, his willingness to ask different questions made him a quiet kind of hero. 4. Winter teaches by taking first, then giving back. That January storm, the one that forced men to crowd inside Elias's cabin, wasn't just a weather event. It was a teacher, a hard one. It took wood. It took comfort. It took pride. It nearly took lives. But in return, it gave clarity. The clarity that design matters, that walls matter, that the way things are usually done is often the most expensive lesson of all. When the sun finally returned to the valley, men looked at their cabins differently. They didn't see 4 walls and a roof. They saw a system, a machine that either worked with winter or fought against it. And most of their cabins were losing that fight. 5. Elias's wall became more than a structure. It became a story. Stories in the frontier spread quickly, faster than news, faster even than storms. Because a good story on the frontier could save a life. Men traveling to other camps retold the tale. The man with the stone wall stayed warm. The wall outlasted the fire. The stove slept, but the cabin didn't. Some listened out of curiosity. Some out of envy. Some because they were tired of waking up cold. Elias Hart didn't try to create a legacy. He simply built a wall. The legacy formed itself. In every generation, there are people who repeat what they've been taught, and a handful who decide to test it. Elias belonged to the second group. And because of that, a small valley survived a winter it had no business surviving. The funny thing about frontier inventions is this: most of them never had names. Nobody called Elias's build a thermal mass heater. Nobody used words like radiant convection, passive energy storage, or heat sink. Those terms belonged to a future Elias would never see. To the men of 1843, it was just Hart's wall. A strange, heavy, unnecessary thing that made no sense until the day it made more sense than anything else in the valley. And over the next few years, something remarkable started to happen. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily, as all true frontier changes do. 1. The valley began to copy what it once mocked. Come spring, after the snow softened and the creek began breaking through its winter shell, a few curious men wandered to Elias's cabin, not with jokes, but with quiet questions. How thick did you make it? What did you pack in the gaps? Did you slope the pipe just so, or does it matter? Think a man could build one of these without tearing his whole cabin apart? Elias didn't posture or guard his secrets. He simply answered. One neighbor built a half-wall version behind his stove. Another added a low brick bench along the north side of his home. A third rerouted his stovepipe to linger behind a stack of river stones before escaping upward. None of them replicated Elias's wall entirely. Some lacked the time, others the strength, and some the stubborn streak. But every man who added even a piece of the idea burned less wood the next winter. Every one of them slept a little deeper. Every one of them woke with fewer frostbitten mornings. That's the thing about good ideas on the frontier. They don't spread by pride. They spread by necessity. 2. The wall became a quiet refuge. Long after the legendary January storm, neighbors continued stopping by Elias's cabin during cold snaps. They didn't say it outright, but everyone knew why they came. The stone bench was warm. The corner by the wall felt like a sanctuary. The chill that gnawed at other cabins never lingered there. Sometimes Elias shared coffee. Other times he simply shared space. A warm wall is a warm welcome without needing words. Men would sit thawing their hands, letting the warmth soak into their spines. Some would sigh without realizing it. One old trapper swore the wall eased his rheumatism. Another claimed it kept the nightmares of frozen nights at bay. Maybe they exaggerated. Or maybe that stone held a comfort deeper than mere degrees. Frontier winters take things from a man. A warm place to rest, even for 10 minutes, gives some of it back. 3. The wall outlasted the men who built it. Years rolled on. Cabins collapsed, men moved, camps shifted. But Elias's wall stayed, long after Elias himself was gone. Years after his tools had rusted and his trail had faded, the heavy stone spine in the center of his cabin refused to fall. Even when the roof sagged and the logs gave way, the wall stood like a monument to stubborn wisdom. Travelers who passed through later said they found it half buried in snow, the stove long gone. The chimney stones scattered, but the core of the wall still solid, still steady, still there. It had no plaque, no story carved into it, no signature, just a mass of stone that had kept one valley warm and kept its secrets. Frontier artifacts rarely survive, but frontier lessons do. 4. A legacy not of fame, but of usefulness. Elias never became a legend. No children's books were written about him. No town named a street after him. He didn't become a folk hero. His wall didn't make him important. It made him useful. And in the wilderness, usefulness is a far truer measure of greatness than fame. A man who builds something that keeps others alive, even quietly, even without seeking attention, leaves behind a legacy that outlives roads, maps, or monuments. The wall didn't just warm a cabin. It warmed a truth we often forget. Wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just works. Slowly, quietly, steadily, the way stone holds heat long after the fire dies. Frontier winters have a way of stripping a life down to what matters. They burn away the excuses, the shortcuts, that's how we've always done it. Habits. And in what's left, what survives the cold, you often find a kind of truth you can't learn anywhere else. Elias Hart didn't set out to become a teacher. He built a wall because he was tired of freezing. He asked questions because the cold demanded answers. He improved his design because winter gave him no choice. But the truth inside his experiment, the quiet wisdom carried in those stones, outlived him. 1. Heat doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Most men believed warmth came only from force, big fires, big stacks of wood, big nights spent tending flames. But Elias showed something different. Heat can be gentle, silent, invisible, and still save a life when the nights get cruel. A calm system beats a frantic one. A thoughtful design beats a desperate scramble. A warm wall can do what a roaring stove cannot. 2. The best ideas aren't always new. They're simply remembered. In many ways, Elias didn't invent anything. He rediscovered what cliffs, caves, and ancient shelters had known forever. Mass stores heat, air wastes it. Modern engineers now call that thermal mass. Elias called it the way rock behaves. But the principle is the same and as true today as it was in 1843. In a world chasing convenience, most folks forget what lasts. But those who live off-grid or close to the land, or simply prefer the quiet reliability of old truths they understand. Sometimes the newest solution is the oldest one. 3. Frontier. Wisdom isn't about being clever, it's about paying attention. Elias didn't follow a blueprint, didn't measure with precision, didn't read from a manual. He watched the land, watched the way heat behaved, watched which shelters nature warmed and which it abandoned, and he trusted what he observed. Real wisdom isn't complicated, it's attentive. 4. A simple life doesn't mean a hard life. Many people today believe simple living means sacrifice, cold nights, primitive tools, endless struggle. But Elias's wall shows the opposite. A simple life can be a smart life. One where the structure does the heavy lifting, one where the fire serves you instead of enslaving you. One where comfort isn't a luxury, it's a byproduct of a well-thought-out design. Frontier life was hard, but not everything about it had to be. 5. The true legacy of that stone wall. Elias Hart is gone. His cabin is long collapsed. The valley has changed. But the lesson remains waiting for anyone willing to hear it. When you build wisely, once you benefit forever. When you build thoughtlessly, you pay every winter. The wall that everyone mocked became the wall that saved lives. Its warmth outlasted the fire. Its legacy outlasted Elias. And its wisdom outlasted the frontier. As you step away from this story and back into your own life, your cabin, your workshop, your tiny home, your dream of living closer to the land, remember this: heat can come from a match, but comfort comes from design. And in a world full of noise shortcuts and fast solutions, the most powerful ideas are still the ones carved quietly into stone, waiting for those with the patience to notice them. Welcome to Wildwood, where old ideas warm new winters.